Hi everyone, Steve here. Thanks for joining me again on the P word. Now, obviously it'd be crazy if I didn't start off on this project by looking at the EU referendum, so here we go. First thing I'm going to focus on with it is the structure of the three main governing bodies that run the EU. Why? Well, because if I've seen one thing over and over again on various Facebook posts, comments under them and news articles, it's the words unaccountable and undemocratic when people are having a dig at the EU. So let's have a look at how true that really is. Now, just keep in mind as I go over this that the institutions involved, they are more complex than what I'm going to share with you here, but obviously I don't want to make this too long and boring, you just need a basic overview. If you do want me to go over them in more detail though, let me know in the comments underneath and I can get some more videos put together for you. Now, first up we've got the EU Commission. This is the executive body of the EU and it represents the interests of the EU as a whole, not favouring one country over another. Now, it's made up of a college of commissioners, currently 28 individuals. Why 28? Well, that's because how many member states there are in the EU. There's one commissioner from each country in the European Union. To put this together, first of all, the European Council proposes a president of the EU Commission. They're voted in by a qualifying majority of the EU Parliament. After that, each member of the College of Commissioners is also put forward by the Council, and then they're voted in by a qualifying majority of the EU Parliament. Now, being the executive body of the EU means the Commission will propose new laws, enforce the laws that are voted into place already by Parliament, and then it sets the objectives and work programme of the EU. Next up, Council of the European Union, as I've just mentioned. This is the voice of government of each of the member states in the EU, and it's composed of a government minister from each of the member states. Part of their role is to adopt the law set out by the EU and to coordinate the policies put forward. Each member state holds what's called the office of the presidency of the EU Council for a period of 6 months, after which it rotates to another member state. And yes, you heard that right, it's the whole state effectively that holds the office of the presidency, not an individual such as a prime minister or an individual president of one of the member states of the EU. Council negotiates around the EU laws alongside the EU Parliament that are proposed by the Commission. It's not just a case of the Commission proposing a law, Parliament voting to accept it, and then the Council making sure that the home state adopts the law. The process involves all states, so the best outcome for the most part can be obtained for each state. Now, last but not least, of course, is the EU Parliament, the big one. The Parliament represents our interests as citizens in the EU as we directly elect the members into office. Now, while Parliament in the EU has no power to propose legislation themselves the way our own Parliament does, they can ask the Commission to do so, which does give the institution of the EU that's directly elected by us quite a lot of power. Now, as I mentioned briefly, Parliament also votes to accept or reject a president that's been proposed by the Council for the Commission and the whole College of Commissioners as well. And not only this, the Parliament is also able to pass what's called a motion of censure. This would effectively force the resignation of a sitting commission in its entirety at the time. This would then be reformed. Now, while this hasn't actually been carried out in full so far, it was threatened once in 1988 at the time when the EU Parliament voted to reject a budget that the Commission had put forward. The threat didn't have to be carried out though, because the Commission resigned in its entirety. It was reformed with a new president and a new College of Commissioners. My point in mentioning this is, of course, the EU Commission is often attacked for being unaccountable. It holds too much power. Actually, it has a lot of accountability. They do answer to Parliament. Now, this is the thing, if you compare this to our own Parliament in the UK, purely on the basis of functional democracy, we have first of all an unelected head of state, so a king or a queen. They inherit their privilege and power purely by chance of birth. Some of you are now going to be up in arms, possibly shouting, our king and queen doesn't have any power. Technically, it does still exist, it is there, but I'm not going to get into that right now. This is about the EU. Now, the other unelected thing we've got in this country is a second chamber of ministers in Parliament called Lords. They're handed their titles and the power that goes with them. There's no scrutiny or input from us as citizens. And there's been a lot of controversy of this over the years where peerages, just the handing out of these titles, is known, given to people who have questionable links maybe to prime ministers and senior government ministers at the time, or they've got a business interest that might conflict with how they choose to vote on certain legislation. Again, not something I'm going to get into detail right now, but I will in the future. As you know, in this country, the leader of the winning party in our general elections is invited to form a government in the name of Her Majesty, and that's entirely based on their own choices. No one can interfere with this but the monarch, and this never really happens. Also, no due consideration is given to how appropriate or not it is for certain individuals to take the senior government posts of the cabinet. Most of the time, they are woefully unqualified to be a Secretary of State for a given function. Again, a topic for another time, but this is the case. You compare that to the selection of the President of the EU Commission by the vote that takes place, the selection of the entire EU Commission by the vote that takes place, the power to censure or throw an entire Commission out by the EU Parliament, and the presidency of the EU Council that's rotated every 6 months. And last but not least, just by virtue of the fact that the members of the European Parliament are all voted into office by the citizens of the EU, it means that you do have a voice in this. If you learn about something you're not happy with, write to your MEP, email them, start a petition and get others involved. Well, these people are our representatives in the European Parliament. If you want them to represent you in a certain way, then tell them. If you don't do any of these things, then you're coming from a very weak position. If you complain about the EU being undemocratic and unaccountable, in the face of that, it does look like the UK functions in a far less democratic way than the EU does. My opinion, really, but that's how it seems. So, thanks for watching again. Please share these vids with anyone you think might appreciate them around social media. As ever, use the comments to feedback to me. Let me know if you think I've made any errors in this information and if you want me to cover a particular topic. Otherwise, catch you next time.